Ashe family, welcome back to another episode of My Unapologetic Perspective. This is the podcast where we give our point of view on controversial topics from my experience, black history, and our knowledge as African Americans. Black history presently lives in us so we can continue to excel into the future. It's one thing to know black history, it's another thing to take advantage of what the people in black history did for you. I am your host, Martre Baker Stevens, and to the right of me is my brother, Shaquan Battle.
Yeah.
And to the right of him is our father, Jerome Battle.
What's up?
We are gathered here today to mourn and to bury TikTok, a place where we grew our audience. Now just playing. That's coming back. They'll end up bringing it back. There's way too much money invested. Way too many people that love that app to the point where they're not going to allow that to continue to be banned. But how are you guys?
Good. I'm good.
Good. Appreciate all the love and support we've been getting. People were happy to see that we were back after a little brief hiatus. But we appreciate all the people that's been rocking with us. Make sure you hit that subscribe button on the YouTube. Make sure you go over to Instagram and follow us and continue to hit those likes and those shares. And we appreciate all the love and support we've been getting. Where are we starting with today, guys?
I know. Last week we had a lot to get to because it was our first episode back, but we didn't speak on you becoming a new father.
Nah, we didn't speak on it. Yeah, man, my son 3 months old now, and it's a beautiful thing. Just embracing it all again, the entire process. Just going back and looking at old pictures from when he was first born to how big he is now, already it's like it's a little emotional. So it's been a great process going into it, and now an even better process of now that he's here.
Question for you. With all the things that you've talked about and all the things that you've learned regarding black history in this country as it stands right now and the foreseeable future, what frightens you about being a parent of a black child, black male child at that?
It's funny because as Dr. King's birthday is coming up, and I've said many of times on this podcast how when it came to SNCC, that a lot of the adults in the NAACP and Dr. King them really didn't want the youth doing what they were doing when it came to the Freedom Riders and SNCC. They didn't want them to do a lot of the protesting and boycotting that they were doing. And before my son, my mindset was kind of like, well, those were the people who were willing to go out and do those things. But from an adult standpoint with the son now, it's the thing that you always talk about is that, yeah, you want them to be black and proud. You want them to fight for their rights. You want them to do all of these things, but you also want them to come home safe. Mm-hmm. And from a parent perspective with the son now, that's one of the main, because black men are the most feared thing in the United States of America. So you want that child to come back safe at the end of the day, but you also want to be black and proud as well.
Yeah, it's tough. And that's kind of, the last couple of weeks I've been reading some of Frederick Douglass's writings. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that he wrote strongly about, one of the things that he wrote strongly about was, it wasn't until I read John Brown mm-hmm. that I started understanding why his narratives changed a little bit after John Brown. And what I mean by that, he began to speak more direct about what was going on in this country after 1859. And I finally realized why. It's because now, for people that don't know, and I don't even know if they teach this in school. Do they teach John Brown in Virginia?
It was one of those things where it may be a sentence or two.
Okay, because I know in D.C. public schools, we did learn a little bit about John Brown, just about as much as we learned about Nat Turner. Mm-hmm. But so for those that don't know, in 1859, John Brown, an enslaved, he was an abolitionist. He was a white guy. Mm-hmm. He was an abolitionist. And he led a group of about 24 or so people the goal was to go into um, Harper's Ferry, which was like a military base in Virginia. The goal was to go in, take it over, and then hopefully get the guns and give that to free and enslaved blacks in the South, hopefully to start some type of civil war, some type of uprising against the white supremacy. Unfortunately, after about 4 days or so, they lost to the Marines. His 2 sons were killed. He and 4 others were captured, and they went on trial, and then they were shortly executed after that. Now, go back before he actually executed his plan. He talked to the likes of Harriet Tubman, and he talked with Frederick Douglass, who was a good friend of his, and he tried to persuade them to join his group. Now, Harriet Tubman agreed, and she gathered a lot of intelligence for him. She also solicited help of free blacks in Canada to assist them. She also gave information to what was called the Secret Six. That was 6 abolitionists who didn't want their names to be known, so they carried information secretly to and from those folks to help organize this event. And but Harriet Tubman could not participate because she fell ill, so she wasn't able to participate. Frederick Douglass said no, mainly because he thought it was a suicide mission. So he basically said no. And here's what Frederick Douglass said. Let me find it, because I think it's important, because to me, I think this shaped a lot of his writings afterwards. So Frederick Douglass, who also was questioned by authorities as to whether he was a co-conspirator or not, because he was so close to John Brown. And he said this about John Brown: Brown's zeal in the cause of my race was far greater than mine. It was as the burning sun to my taper light. Mine was bounded by time, his stretched a ways beyond boundless shores of eternity. I could live for the slave, but he could die for him. Douglass described John Brown's modest living circumstances, his devotion to his wife and children, and in the speech he says, Patrick Henry loved liberty for the rich and the great. Brown loved liberty for the poor and the weak. Although Abraham Lincoln did not see Brown as a revolutionary, he too said Brown was acting with the people who were inclined to rise up and bring about their own liberation. Harriet Tubman said John Brown done more for dying than 100 men would do in the living. And I wanted to talk about that for 2 reasons. The first being, I said something last week about the Caitlin Clark thing in the WNBA that I think some people may have taken out of context. I'm not saying that as a black American, I'm not happy that she spoke up about the racism in the WNBA, because I am. Right. I am. We do need that. My point was, just because she brought it up doesn't make it valid. Right. It was already valid. Right. I want to make that clear. So I thought about the fact that in every cause for Black America, there has been white people who stood and died for our cause. So I wanted to be clear about that, and John Brown was one of them. This, for a lot of people, believe that this was the beginning of the Civil War, because this happened in 1859. 2 years later, you get the war. So I wanted to bring that up because I think that was important, that he was willing, and he lost 2 sons. Like I said, he lost 2 sons in this thing. Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's true. That's. I mean, and then that goes. That's not the white savior either. That's just somebody who's trying to do the right thing, or what they think is the right thing, and willing to die behind it. You're not going to meet a lot of people like that. Not even like black folks. No. You know what I'm saying? Like James Baldwin said, I don't love all black people, because there are some judges or some pastors and some political people who I don't love so much, who are black, but they're not black like me. You know what I'm saying? So even in that's not the white savior effect. Sometimes you can champion some white people who genuinely did things for the cause. And if you're willing to die for it, then that's just genuine as it gets.
That's right. I didn't know this either, but a couple of the people that was involved in the Marines during that time it ended up being Grant,
Yeah.
Robert E. Lee Grant. Robert E. Lee, I'm sorry, ended up being one of the commanding officers. And then Stonewall Jackson was one of the officers who actually arrested John Brown.
Yeah.
And then four of the people who escaped ended up going on and fighting in the Civil War for the North.
Yeah, and that was your first that was your resistance that basically helped create the Civil War.
That's right.
What else we going? Where are we going?
Wherever you want to go.
Well, I ain't want to take up, because last episode I took up a lot of the bulk of the time, and I ain't want to do that again. So I want to give y'all opportunity.
I just keep thinking about the timelines, about some of the things that happen, man, and it's the irony of it is this. So Nat Turner, that took place what, 1831? I think I was 1831.
Yeah, and I'm already see where you're going, and
yeah. 1831.
Even when you think of the abolishment of slavery in New York,
that's right.
The slaves' insurrection contributed to that.
That's right.
So when you look at, and again, that goes back to when we talked about how some people just think that black people were slaves and they just accepted it. It's just not true.
It's not true. That's right. They rose up. But I think about the timeline. So 1831, you get Nat Turner. 1859, you get John Brown. 1861, you get the Civil War. Right. 90 years later, they kill Emmett Till.
Yeah.
90 years later. That's a whole nother generation.
Yeah.
So for the people that says that racism doesn't exist, not only does it exist, it's taught.
Yeah.
Because you have a whole new generation of people who arrested illegally, tortured, beat, and murdered Emmett Till 90 years later.
Yeah.
Right? So, because that was what, 1955?
Mm-hmm.
Right? 1965 through 1968, you get the Civil Rights Movement. Right?
Yeah.
Then shortly after that, in the 70s, well, at the end of 69, you got Martin Luther King assassinated. You got the Kennedys assassinated, right? In the 70s, we get...
Well, you had Malcolm killed, too.
Yep, Malcolm killed. In the 70s, we have...
You had Fred Hampton killed.
In the 80s, you...
The Reagan era.
Yeah. And then in the 90s, you're getting... Rodney King.
Mm-hmm.
You get Rodney King. And then in the 2000s, and we'll just skip 2000 through whatever, and you get to George Floyd.
Trayvon Martin.
So this is a whole different generation of people than it was in 1831 or 1859 or 1955.
Right.
So for the people that say it don't exist, not only does it exist, it's being taught. Because you have a whole... They don't just come out of the womb and say, I hate black people.
Right.
They're being taught this.
And there's like pictures going around of... I can't remember off the top of my head, but they're like people that you think lived a long time ago was alive around the same time people today are. It's because you get people who lived in their old age, and then you got young kids, like even Jerry Jones, who was around during the civil rights time, and you get that picture of him, and then you look at the NFL today and the way that he structured his organization.
That's right.
The mindset doesn't change.
Right.
That's
You
right.
know what I'm saying? So these people, it's the each one teach one.
Each one.
The each one
That's
teach one is not just a
good
phrase
thing.
of positivity.
That's
The each
right.
one teach one, and also be some bullshit that happened before that your grandparents or your great grandparents taught you, and then you're moving along that you passing on to your kids, and they live by things that their grandparents said without ever changing the mindset.
That's right. Absolutely.
But what I wanted to get to is something, and you could attest to this because we have a lot of the same admiration for certain things. And one of the things that I want to recognize, because we talked about black women on a podcast before, we did a couple episodes, and you know, a lot of people considered it pandering, but it's really not pandering when you actually deep dive into these individuals and you deep dive into our personal lives and the way that we look at black women. But I want to analyze a lot of the black women of the 70s because, when you go back and you look at the 50s and the 60s, you can even go back before then when you look at people like Sojourner Truth or Harriet Tubman or Ida B. Wells, who was around during that time period, but even earlier Ida B. Wells writing. The women of the 70s changed the role of the black woman, right? And as we look at this, when you look at the 50s and 60s, black women, as we talked about before, did extraordinary things, but a lot of it was behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. If you ask most people in the world who Ella Baker is, they won't know who she is. Right. They won't know who Fannie Lou Harmer is. Now, you'll know people like Rosa Parks because of what she did, created so much news around it. You know what I'm saying? But how many times did you ever see Rosa Parks give a speech?
That's right.
How many times did you see Rosa Parks organize and directing things or in meetings and that? She didn't have that opportunity to do so because during that time, when you look at the civil rights movement, they didn't allow women to be in those positions. Right. Now they did great things, Diane Nash and all of these other people, but
they was all behind the scenes.
Yeah, it was behind the scenes work. But when you looked at the 70s, things changed.
That's right.
Right? Because it birthed a new black woman who saw the way things was going in the civil rights movement and kind of shifted to said, no, we're not going to allow that to happen. I'm going to just go down a timeline of some things that happened in the 70s. In 1970, Cheryl Brown, Miss Iowa, became the first African-American contestant in the Miss America pageant. In 71, Beverly Johnson appears on the cover of Glamour, the first African-American woman to be featured that way by a major fashion magazine. 72, Shirley Chisholm became the first African-American woman candidate for president with more than 150 delegate votes at the 1972 Democratic Convention. 72, Angela Davis acquitted in California by an all-white jury of charges from the 1970 shootout. 74, Shirley Chisholm became the first African-American woman elected to Congress. 75, Joanne Little acquitted of murder charges. She had stabbed a jailer with an ice pick to avoid sexual assault. In 76, Barbara Jordan was the first woman and the first African-American to give the keynote address at a national convention of the Democratic Party. In 76, Unita Blackwell elected mayor of Mayersville, becoming the first black woman mayor in Mississippi. In 78, Toni Morrison received the National Book Critics Award. And in 79, Hazel Winfield Johnson became the first African-American woman appointed as a general in the U.S. Army. So when you think about Black History Month that's coming up, you're going to see the same women. You're going to see Rosa Parks. You're going to see Harriet Tubman. You're going to see the same women over and over again. And not to discredit Sojourner Truth and Ida B. Wells and all these people. We talked about them. We love what they did. But we also don't want to gloss over what the women in the 70s did. Women like Elaine Brown, like Angela Davis, like recently passed Nikki Giovanni, like Kathleen Cleaver. We don't want to discredit what they did just because, and I'll get to it a little bit, a lot of men felt inferior by these women. Like I said, these women spoke their minds. They were educated. They risked their lives. They were on the front lines. These women held it down when being tracked by the FBI, being raided by the FBI, when being set in prison. Like, they dealt with a different type of belief to the point where a lot of these people didn't expect to live.
That's right.
It goes back to what you were saying about John Byrne. It's different from people who can write behind scenes and use an alias and go back into their own comfort zone. But it's different from people who are being threatened every single day of being killed. But when you look at, again, most of these people joined the Black Panther Party because of the civil rights movement and the way it was moving. It was black men, again, coming from a church perspective, where black women aren't allowed to preach. They're not allowed to lead. So you had younger black women coming up in there said, oh, no, that's not good enough. That's not good enough to be behind the scenes. No disrespect to Rosa Parks, no disrespect to Ella Baker, but we're not doing that. You know what I mean? So in 66% of the Black Panther Party were black women.
That's right.
And then, of course, you see the no makeup, the afros, the natural beauty that a lot of black women are going back to today. And then they ran most of the programs that we talk about in the Black Panther Party, like the free health program,
the lunch program,
free breakfast and lunch program, free legal program, the free groceries in the community, the free busing, the free ambulance. In fact, in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, the women were medically trained and medically licensed in the free ambulance thing, and they did a lot of the writing in the newspaper. So when I look at women like Kathleen Cleaver, who was the first black woman to actually have power within Black Panther Party, she was the spokesperson. Not just a writer, not just somebody who taught the elementary school. She was the spokesperson, which means I speak on behalf of the party. When Huey ain't around, when Bobby ain't around, or when they around,
Right.
I'm the one that's got the microphone.
Face of the
Yeah,
organization.
and she led the Free Huey campaign. You know, in fact, when you Google the Black Panther Party, she's one of the first pictures
ones that
you'll
pop
see.
up.
You
That's
know,
right.
she said her role in the Black Panther Party was the same as the man's. And she was huge on the free breakfast program. She was huge on the free legal aid, but she was more huge on the free busing and the busing, taking people back and forth to prison to see their people. Because you got to remember, the FBI targeted everybody in the Black Panthers,
That's right.
men, women, and children. So a lot of people were locked up on trumped up charges that weren't going to stick anyway. But a lot of the family members was able to get back and forth to prison to see their family members. And then she once had to go into exile because her husband, who me and you don't care for, did some things, and he had to flee America, and she had to, by being pregnant, had to hold it down.
Hold it down.
You know what I'm saying?
And I think that last part is the tale of the tape for what went on in the 70s, is that black women were forced to do something different than what they did in the 60s. Because in the 70s came your government assistant programs for housing and for what is essentially called today in most places welfare. And in order for you to get that assistance, there could be no man living in the house.
Yeah.
They would actually come through and knock on the door, make sure there was no males living in the house, males of working age living in the house. So a lot of fathers left. Some of them claimed that they left because they had a better chance without them. But a lot of them just left because it was easier for them to leave than it was for them to stay.
Right.
So the women had no choice. Now you have women who went decades of simply being housewives and stay-at-home mothers to now having to not only work but lead the family of multiple kids. So they had to work, they had to teach, they had to clean, and they had to be mothers to their kids. They had to do it all. Oh, and by the way, now they got to start going to PTA conferences and determine that, wait a minute, this school curriculum ain't shit. This is not going to help my child. So now I got to get on the board so I can change what's being taught to my child. This was all black women. This wasn't men. This was all black women. So during the 70s, they were forced to take a different role. And then from there, they said, you know what, if I can be the chairperson for the PTA, I can also be mayor or councilwoman or senator or congresswoman.
Or run for president.
Whatever, or president.
Yeah.
Whatever it is I need to do, I know that I'm capable, and now is the time to start that. If not for me, for the next woman after me.
Right.
So they were willing to do that in the 70s, and that's what they did.
And again, I go back. I credit the civil rights movement for that, because the civil rights movement helped them organize.
That's right.
It helped them be able to do all of these things. And then when the 70s hit, they transitioned from, again, behind the scenes to the
That's right.
forefront. And people like Erica Huggins, whose husband, John Huggins, was killed by the FBI.
That's right.
She still held it down. Right
That's
after
right.
he killed, she go to New Haven, Connecticut, and start the chapter of the Black Panther Party there, and led it.
That's right.
Director of the community school in Oakland, where
That's
she
right.
helped educate elementary school kids. Held it down
That's
while
right.
being a political prisoner for 2 years. Then was acquitted of all charges, and charges were dropped, and she was released. Again, she was a member of the Black Panther Party for 14 years, the longest membership for any woman being involved. And she said this, and I quote, "Why would women like Rosa Parks and Lena Horne, who were capable of speaking out about anything, anywhere, why would they not be speaking? Why are they just sitting there?" And that was like a precursor to my feminist understanding, that moment. I think it's important to place the women who fought oppression as Black Panthers within the longer tradition of freedom fighters like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Ada B. Wells, who took an entirely oppressive world and insisted that their race, their gender, and their humanity be respected all at the same time. The next person is a little bit of controversial because of some of her philosophy beliefs, but you still got to give love to Angela Davis.
Yeah.
Again, became a member of the Black Panther Party. And the reason why she's so controversial because she was a known believer of communism. And she directed the political education in L.A. And she fought hard for the Soledad brothers. For the people who don't know what the Soledad brothers are, they were 3 imprisoned inmates in the Soledad prison, and there was a fight that took place in the rec yard, and then the policeman or the correctional officer with the rifle shot and killed like 3 or 4 different inmates. Mm-hmm. And then in retaliation, another correctional officer was killed, to where these 3 particular black inmates were charged with this murder. The officer who killed the inmates was actually acquitted either. But during the trial, one of the inmates' brother attempted to get him escaped from prison, and the co-conspirators and the defendant was killed. And Angela Davis, the guns was registered to Angela Davis. That's right. And Angela Davis went on the FBI most wanted list, and to the point where she was apprehended and she served 18 months in prison. But serving 18 months, she was found not guilty by an all-white jury. But serving those 18 months, she started to realize how big prison reform was, because a lot of the people who were Black Panthers were treated the worst inside of the prison system. Right. But she also became a known speaker against the Vietnam War. And one of her quotes is, when Obama was elected president, a prisoner said 1 black man in the White House doesn't make up for 1 million black men in the big house. And then, of course, the beloved recently transitioned to an ancestor, Nikki Giovanni. You know, I've listened to her and James Baldwin's conversation 10 or 12 times.
Tell you, her perspective from a woman's point of view is something that I think every young black woman should definitely listen to, but also every young black man, just to understand what a black woman requires of you. Yeah. In a relationship. She wants all of you.
Yeah, and you know, I thought about that because after she died, she got a little flack just because of course, she married a white woman. Yes. But if people that talk about that listen to Nikki Giovanni from the 70s on, they read Nikki Giovanni from the 70s on, and they take a deep dive into her life, black men never changed to the point where she wanted them to be.
Yeah, you know, she decided that she wanted to have a baby, and her statement was she wanted to have a baby and she could afford to have one. Yeah. And because at one point there were some proceedings that were trying to rule her unfit to be a mother. Mm-hmm. But, you know, the basis of her having a baby was she had a right to. Mm-hmm. And nobody could stop her, whether she was heterosexual or homosexual. Nobody could stop the fact that she could have a baby. But in one of her conversations with James Baldwin was saying, I could never lie to you if I love you. Yeah. And she was like, oh, yeah, you can. If you can go down to the job and lie and smile in that white man's face,
you lie to everybody else. Yeah,
you lie to everybody else. You can go down there and lie to him and say he's the greatest and then come home and take it out on me. How come I can't get that part of you?
Yeah, why can't you lie when you come home?
Lie to me and come home and be smiling in a good mood. Yeah. I don't need you to come in and be truthful with me and hurt me because they doing something to you down at the job. Yeah. I want that part of you too. You know,
she has a poem called Seduction. That's one of my favorite poems. And in the poem, it's about the woman trying to seduce the black man.
That's right.
And in the end, the man said, "Isn't this non-revolutionary?" Or some sense of like that. I'm paraphrasing. And what she was always talking about is, yes, we can go out in the streets, be pro-black, fight the power, do all of these things, but when we come home, you have to let some of that anger go.
That's right.
And be able to love. So most of her poetry were love poems because she wanted the black man to kind of take off all of the world at some point.
That's right. That's at least behind closed doors at home.
Yeah, and become to love. And we'll get into a little bit about that in a second, but she wrote poems like Ego Tripping, which in the 1970s just celebrated black people, black history. You know, she talked about Nefertiti being black in the 70s. She talked about the pyramid builders being black. She talked about Hannibal Lecter being black in these poems, about Noah being black. Like, these were things that were being written in the 70s. Again, a lot of women in the 60s couldn't say this stuff.
That's right.
And then Nikki Giovanni, them come through in the 70s, what we call the revolutionary black writers, that began to be more militant about their writing. She wrote poems for black men like, I want to say, just got to say something about those beautiful, beautiful, beautiful out of sight black men with their afros. Hey, walking down the street is the same old danger, but a brand new pleasure. And if you get time, I would love to read it on air, but it's too much. It's too long. Please go and read her poem called Nikki Rosa, in which she writes for Rosa Parks, but she starts with the Pullman Porters. And then from the Pullman Porters, she goes into Emmett Till. Like, go back and read that poem because it's a beautiful timeline.
That's right.
Of the civil rights movement and the lead up to where we are, to where they were at that point. And the last one I'm going to just talk about really quick, and then I got a question for you guys, is Elaine Brown. Elaine Brown, of course, rose the ranks high at Black Panther Party, where she replaced Eldridge Cleaver once he got exiled.
Right.
And then she also, appointed by Huey Newton when he had to flee to Cuba, she became the chairperson of the Black Panther Party. And she was huge on the legal aid. She was huge on the free breakfast program. She ran for, I believe, city council, if I'm not mistaken. But when it comes to Elaine Brown, and one of the reasons why I want to dive into this as a whole was when Huey appointed her as the chairperson while he was gone, this is what created a lot of controversy because a lot of black men still didn't want to follow a black woman. They didn't want to follow a woman. And that was a huge reason why most of these women that I'm talking about left the Black Panther Party. And again, all of these women continued to educate afterwards, whether it was at a university, whether it was in some type of program, they continued to educate or continue to write, continue to be published, continue to serve on boards and all of these other things. So they continue to do great work. But even when we talked about black women on a couple episodes before, the comments was brutal against black women. And you see so many black men who don't feel comfortable with black women being in leadership. That's right. Even to this day. And I'm not talking about Kamala Harris. I'm talking about other black politicians that's running for office where black women don't get that support from black men because a lot of black men don't feel comfortable with them being in those roles.
Support, and they don't get that respect.
What are y'all thoughts behind that?
I feel like black men is probably in fear, even white men, not just black men, but even white men is in fear of a black woman being a leader in anything, because like the programs you named for the Black Panther Party, if you hadn't said women started that, it just sounds like women's thinking. No man could come up with that.
Well, even there, let's just say, because we don't really know who came up with it. So let's just say, for instance, let's just say Huey and Bobby Seale came up with these programs. Let's just say this is something that they wanted to do for the community. Who was going to do it?
Women. I mean, anytime you want to organize something, you got to have some
women. You got to have women.
I'm telling you, you put 10 men on a committee to organize something, you got a problem.
Because when we talk about the programs of free education, who's going to be the elementary school teachers?
Women.
When we talk about the free breakfast program, who's going to cook
Women.
the food?
Who's
You
going
know
to
what I'm
serve
saying?
it? Women.
So when we talk about all of these things, we talk about the free medical. Who are going to be the ones that's
Women.
go get this nursing training? So yes, black men may have came up with the idea, but as far as making it function the correct way, come on now.
Let's just be honest. The average male, and in most cases the above average male, is intimidated by women. It's a known fact. Most men won't play women in a athletic or compete against a woman in an athletic event for one reason and one reason only. They're afraid to lose to a woman.
Yeah.
But we create that though when we say, Johnny throws like a girl, as if a girl can't
Right,
throw.
right.
Right? So when you but now you can't say that because Johnny does throw like a girl because a girl throws really good.
Right.
You know, so it's one of those things where I think we've developed this narrative about women that whether people want to admit it or not, it becomes a part of who you are, that you are intimidated by them, especially in a competitive sense. If you look at today's Congress, they are a lot of women that are outspoken in Congress, but they still don't get the respect from the men that they deserve.
Yeah.
Just if I don't know if any of you guys ever watch C-SPAN and watch any of the things regarding Congress on C-SPAN, but just to watch the way that the men interact with the women in those settings, so disrespectful. So disrespectful. And now women like Jasmine Crockett, if you don't know who that is, Google her. She speaks up. She's one of the Democratic representatives from the state of Texas, one of the most racist states in America. But she's earning these men's respect because they can't refute her information. So we always talk about, as black people, when you go into an environment, especially a work environment, you have to be better than your white counterparts. Women got it twofold. They got to be better, especially black women. You got to be better than any other white. But then as a woman, you got to be better than any other male, regardless of their color.
And I've been around, even just at our job, like I've been around black women supervisors who ran a tight ship. You know what I'm saying? And the reason why they ran a tight ship is because they knew that they could not make the same mistakes that a man could get away with. And one of the things that Nikki was talking about in the conversation with James Baldwin, and even more things that she said throughout the 70s and even in the 80s, was that, of course, she went to live with her grandmother at an early age because her father would come home and beat her mother. And she couldn't take that.
Right.
And that's one of the things that she said that I would never tolerate that. So, and she couldn't understand how the black man could go out into the world, be treated like a nigga, get all of this hatred towards him, and then he come home and give it to his wife.
And not fight.
Yeah.
And not fight, but then come home and give it to
Yeah.
not just his wife, but kids too.
Yeah.
I mean, the 70s was a tough time for black families.
And as I was thinking, do you think that we know the 80s was the kill shot to the black family, but was the 70s?
The 70s was the beginning, because it removed, and I'll say it because it was a large experience that removed black males from the household in the 70s. So it was an experience that women, instead of folding, they stepped up. But it happened. It removed black men, and the black men that stayed did exactly what Nikki's talking about, is they will go out into white America and be discriminated against, treated unfairly, unjustly, called certain names, embarrassed, humiliated, whatever. And then they came home and took it out on their families at home. And that's what she's talking about, is if you have all this fight, why don't you do it out there instead of coming home taking it out on me? That was every household, black household, especially in metropolitan cities like Washington, D.C., Chicago, New York, that every black family dealt with, include mine.
Was it forced, or was it a mindset change of black women that
it was forced?
Okay,
it was forced.
Okay.
They had no choice. When you have 4 kids and the father steps, what you gonna do? What you gonna do?
I don't mean not the father stepping. I mean, women who say, black women who say, even today, because that's why I said the 70s is the beginning, where black women may step aside and say, I'll take it from here. Because the way you're doing things, I don't need that.
It was both. So even the men that stay, well, let's look at Good Times. Look at Good Times. Even though it was a comedy, it was based on real life events that was happening in the 70s. So in Good Times, James could never keep a job, right? What did Florida do? She went out and got a job as a school bus driver, right? I'm going to help, right? Then James died. Then what? Now it's all on her. So this was a thing that just happened depending on what your circumstances was, but they was forced into that. Not that they weren't willing, not that they wouldn't have participated any other way. The man wouldn't let them. Society wouldn't let them. But when circumstances started to change, and white and black mothers was put in that position where you had to stand up or run, they chose to stand up. But they were put in that situation. Now, of course, there are some black mothers and some black women in the 70s that weren't forced, but a majority of them was.
Right, and I was just saying not forced because when I listen and read Nikki, and even reading Toni Morrison, it was like the black man was unlovable to the point where I'm not dealing with this. To the point where I'm stepping, not the man leaving, but the black woman saying, possibly, I'll be the man too.
I would say a majority of them was forced where the man either left or the man wasn't holding it down. There weren't, and you can, even all those black ladies that you named at the beginning from 1970 to 1979, all of them have similar stories.
Yeah,
and they will all tell you the same thing. It was a situation that something had to happen, and it really wasn't the mother standing up going, I had enough of this. Because during the 70s, you were ridiculed if you did that. You're ridiculed if you left your husband. And part of our issues today is inherited. And I'm just going to be blunt. Is how many people have heard stories about a nasty uncle that did something to a niece or a grandchild and they swept it under the rug.
Right.
Told you, don't say anything. Make sure that you guys don't go near your Uncle Henry or whatever. Whatever the situation was, it got swept under the rug.
Right.
Why? Because that person probably produced something within the family and they didn't want to lose that production. And by that person going to jail. So they didn't tell. Every black family in the 70s have something that's similar to that situation. Why didn't the women stand up then? It was too much to lose at the time. So they had to take that and you move on. But then once the men was gone, once Uncle Henry decided to leave, now I have no choice.
Okay.
But it was really a forced situation in most of those situations. And I can tell you from experience, my mom always wanted to work. My dad didn't want her to. And it wasn't until they got divorced that my mom was able to go get a job. She always wanted a job. My mom had a college degree. My dad didn't want her to use it. Because in the 70s, if your woman went out and worked, that was humiliating to you as a black man.
That you're not holding it down.
That you ain't holding it down. Right. James Evans used to say it all the time. Florida, what they gonna say about me when they see you out there working?
Right.
So it was a prideful thing for black men to take care of their families. And then when they couldn't stand to watch the woman excel. So they left. And I'm not saying that was the case for all women, but you go back and look through the history of the 70s. Even Muhammad Ali talked about it. He talked about what he saw in Chicago, what he saw in Louisville, Kentucky, with black families and how black women was put into a situation where they had no choice but to step up.
So we've been talking about a timeline, and Bake said the 70s is where it started. The 80s, what would the 80s be? That would be the drug that took the man out of the house?
Well, you had a couple things. So Reaganomics in, I guess, 1981. So when Reaganomics hit and they removed a lot of the monies from a lot of these programs that black families could take advantage of, like be able to go to college and get these grants and not have to pay, all that was taken away. Ronald Reagan wanted to use that money for other things. So then black families had to do something different. So in those cases, what did a lot of black families go to? hate to say it, but a lot of them resulted to crime. However, there were some that started thinking the way we're talking on this podcast, where instead of education, they start thinking vocation. They start thinking trade. You got a lot of plumbers, a lot of electricians, black plumbers and black electricians that came out of the 80s because of that. There may not have been any money to go to a university or a college, but there was plenty funding to go to vocational or trade schools. So you got a lot of people in the 80s that did that.
So now what about the 90s?
90s was a continuation, because a lot of people think, when you think about the 80s, you think about crack and you think about 1985, 1986. But you got to remember, crack extended way beyond that.
Yeah.
So when crack went into the 90s, you had a whole new era of drugs, because you still had old school drugs like heroin, and then for people that lived in the city, you had things like Love Boat. Like not a lot of people didn't hear it. So now you had all these different drugs, and still the most prominent one was just pure powder cocaine. That's now accessible to everybody, where before only certain people could get it. Then everybody has access to it. You can have a connect in Miami, where before all your connects would be in New York. You had connects everywhere, so everybody has access to it. So,
But yeah, and the 90s still continue from the effects of the 80s, because everybody in the 80s was in prison or dead.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or trying to get their life back together. So
you can see a whole lot hasn't changed in the mindset, especially in Black America, between the 90s and right now. And
So is it a, I don't want to say a direct connection, but is there a connection to when you said stuff like when welfare and all of that started, and it was easier for the man to say, you know what, y'all can get the money and I'll just leave. That started the timeline for black women to say, okay, it's time for us to stand up.
Yeah, I
From
think,
the 70s, 80s, and the 90s.
I think that, along with some concepts, when people talk about Black and I'm proud, and you had a lot of women who took that concept that I'm a woman and I'm proud, and they started saying, hey, we're relevant, sort of like Black Lives Matter did after George Floyd, where you had women say women lives matter.
and it led to more feminism.
Yes.
Because of the leadership in Black Panther Party, again, with these women, it led to more feminism talk.
That's right.
So when you talk about Toni Morrison, Nikki Giovanni, Angela Davis, and a lot of these great writers, you're talking about the more uplifting the black woman. Because again, when the black woman had her time in the sun, she thrived. So why wouldn't you want to continue that?
That's right.
I recommend that book, Conrad Sisters, Women of the Black Panther Party, that has stories from living black women that were a part of the Black Panthers and talked about what they did on an everyday basis. The foreword is from Angela Davis. Great. I recommend love poems. But a lot of Nikki Giovanni's love poems and poetry. Within that, we got to do a deep dive on that one day too. Just poetry in general, or black history. Just black history and poetry.
Okay.
Slams and all that. We got
I think
to.
that's probably one thing that we haven't touched.
Yeah.
On
Yeah.
here.
I think we talked about poetic. We talked about writers. We talked about
Well, not the evolution of of spoken word.
yeah.
Okay.
But anything else y'all got?
Just a little cleanup in our own backyard. This past week, in Philadelphia, Noah Scurry, 17 years old, was killed in the back alley of his house, 7:15 in the morning, getting into the car with his mom to go to school, because the day before, he put out a rap video, and in it he has a Joker mask on and a gun, and he's dissing other people that supposedly they have beef with. Everybody says phenomenal basketball player, and just scored the highest in the school on the SAT. On his regular Instagram, he really didn't show his face, but he had another Instagram that was called Joker TV, where he basically did the street stuff. So to parents, if your kids have social media, check the phones.
Yeah.
Check the phones. 17 years old.
May he rest in power. another one of those ones, man, where there's nobody to blame but our own community.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And then
Yeah.
in Lynchburg, a teenager was just shot by another teenager. It's like it's becoming so normal, even for our area. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? You know, when I'm talking to my homeboy and his kids are 15, 16 years old in Lynchburg, I'm like, hey, they know the kid that got shot. Yeah, they knew both of them. And I'm like, dang, that imagine what these children have to go through on an everyday basis of just knowing someone that's killed already
Right.
at the age that they're at.
Just think about the music that glorifies that.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
know, the music that, you know, they listen to glorifies carrying a gun and shooting people and even getting shot. It glorifies it.
Yeah.
You know, until that stops, until we stop glorifying it in our own communities, who's gonna stop it?
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
that's the thing about Noah is, you know, he was getting in the passenger side of a car and his mom was getting in the driver's side. Luckily, you know, prayerfully she wasn't hit, but to see your son gunned down at 7:15 in the morning when you about to take him to school.
They got easy access to guns, man. And a lot of them don't think about the consequences.
No.
But may you rest in power. We appreciate y'all. We love y'all. Peace.